In 1971, Ayn Rand wrote the following about the field of psychology. As a science, psychology is barely making its first steps. It is still in the anteroom of science, in the stage of observing and gathering material from which a future science will come. This stage may be compared to the pre-Socratic period in philosophy. Psychology has not yet found a Plato, let alone an Aristotle, to organize its material, synthesize its problems, and define its fundamental principles. Call to action, you might say. But even so, 53 years later, I basically still agree with Rand's assessment. I do think the field has made a great deal of progress in that time, but most of that progress is in the form of generating more material and dealing with more problems, most of which have yet to be systematized, organized, and integrated into fundamental principles. To be fair, there have been credible efforts in that direction within subfields and schools of thought. I have been part of some of those efforts, in all seriousness. But even there, it's still nascent. It's still very much a work in progress, and it's a partial view of a very messy, complicated whole. So today, in these 90 minutes that we have to sample the sampling of a very complicated and heterogeneous field, I want to try to accomplish these two things. I want to give you a really, really broad, low-resolution map of the field as it stands today. And then I want to zoom in on a couple of specific findings, a couple of detailed examples chosen semi-at random to give you a close-up view of what it might look like to reap value from work in this nascent field, particularly when armed with an objectivist lens. So that's what I want to achieve. To start, we need a definition. Very briefly, psychology is the science of the mind. So let's unpack that. Let's look at the species and the genus of this definition in turn. So the subject matter of psychology is the mind. Now, herein, I think, lies one of the reasons, maybe the big reason, why this field is still so nascent compared to fields like philosophy, biology, physics. Because the subject matter, psychology, is, in my view, one of, if not the most complex phenomenon in the known universe. And it has inputs from and dependencies upon all those other fields that I just mentioned. Okay, there are three broad sources of complexity that I think are very real. First, the mind itself is a collection of faculties like perception, memory, reasoning, emotions, associations, abstraction, empathy, choice, deliberation, learning, temperament, bonding, so on and so on and so on. Okay? The list is so long as to require a course just to enumerate it. And all of these faculties, they're not proper parts. Like, these are all distinct things that are all happening side by side. They interpenetrate, they overlap, they're all sort of part of each other, but also interdependent on each other, and it's a sprawling mess. But like, in actuality, right, it's an incredibly complicated organism, the human mind. And then the object of awareness, right, what it is that the mind is locking onto, trying to understand, trying to navigate, is an incredibly complicated world, right? That includes both the physical world and all the complexities involved in sort of dynamically kind of modeling and interacting with and updating our mental models of that world. And then it includes a complex social world that comes with its own emergent complexities as a function of the fact that it is a bunch of minds interacting and forming cultures and creating, sums that are greater than the whole of their parts. So that's a further source of complication. And then there's also the fact that the mind is running on and connected to a body. We are mind-body organisms, and that includes, but is certainly not limited to, the brain and the nervous system. And a really complex living organism, right, which is subject to entropy and energy transfer and homeostasis, and all those biological facts about us as organisms also have consequences for how we think and feel and behave, the premises that we form. And all these things are part of one really, really complicated whole. Okay, so yeah, no wonder we're just getting started in understanding this phenomenon in the level of detail that psychology as a science aspires to. And what this also means is that psychology inherits all the controversies of philosophy, which bears on the nature of the mind-body relationship, the nature of the mind's relationship to the world, right? And also all the controversies of biology, which supplies a lot of the methods and findings and inputs to the more biological interactions that we study as psychologists. So we're a very dysfunctional family as psychologists, and we blame our parenting for a lot of our problems. But that said, okay, the actual sort of sociological composition of the field of psychology is that it's composed of a whole bunch of subfields that all sort of try to tackle some subset of these complexities that I just described. So let me give you a very cursory and incomplete tour of some of those subfields, just to give you a sense of the variety of topics and findings encompassed under this very broad umbrella that is psychology. So cognitive psychology, in no particular order here. In the broadest terms, cognitive psychology deals with questions of how we form or fail to form knowledge about the world. So what kinds of questions are included under that umbrella? Cognitive psychology includes the study of learning and memory. How do we come to remember certain things and not other things, and what different kinds of memory are there? What factors influence whether and how accurately we remember? Whether what we remember actually has that much correspondence to what originally occurred, or what we, in fact, were presented with in the encoding episode. This is just one random example of a finding from cognitive psychology that speaks to the context dependence of memory. These are divers who either learned a set of words while underwater or on land, and then they remembered more of those words when they were in the same environment as they had been at encoding. So it's not about just like you learn better on land, but rather you learn better if you're in the same sort of situation you were in at encoding. I took advantage of this by sort of doing like a little mini dry run of my talk right here on this spot. We'll see if it pays off, whether this replicates. And then another subset of the broader realm of cognitive psychology is attention, which turns out to be a complicated beast in its own right. How does attention work? What are its sort of subcomponents? What are the different kinds of attention? Are some more voluntary versus more automatic than others? Yes. And how do those different kinds of attention interact, etc.? If you're not familiar with this experiment that's pictured here. This is a classic experiment, one of probably millions, it's fair to say, within cognitive psychology, the Stroop test. And if you haven't already noticed, a funny feature of this image, the words read different colors than the font of said words. And the task, the experimental condition, typically is the one in which you're instructed to say the ink color of each word while ignoring the written word itself. So if you've never been exposed to it, you can just take a second and just try it in your head and notice what's hard about it. This is a test that pits our overlearned, automatized attentional focus, which is on reading, which is kind of a cool thing in itself, that as adults, we have so automatized reading that it's the easier thing for us to do, and we've learned to actually abstract away the font color of what we're reading. And so now to deliberately, consciously choose to focus on the color and ignore the word turns out to be really hard. And this turns out to be a useful proxy for all kinds of individual differences in attentional ability, inhibitory control, and so on. So just an isolated example. And then cognitive psychology also deals with how we form concepts and associations and beliefs, and what is even the difference between those things, and also, having formed them, how our existing concepts, beliefs, memories then affect the further judgments that we make and where our attention gets directed, and then how that in turn affects the new concepts, memories, and beliefs that we form. If you're not familiar with the idea of confirmation bias, right, probably most of you have encountered it somewhere by now, right? The finding, the very well replicated and personally observable finding that we tend to notice and attend to and remember things that fit our pre-existing assumptions, premises, which is one of the many ways that our beliefs tend to self-reaffirm and sort of self-perpetuate. Remember I mentioned homeostasis before? It's like the psychological analog of what our body is always trying to do to keep us stable. And then a really important major part of cognitive psychology deals with good versus bad reasoning, and with a special emphasis on the bad, but also on the ways to correct the bad in favor of the good. So if you haven't read, or if you've encountered the work of Kahneman and Tversky, and particularly Kahneman, who passed away recently, whose book Thinking Fast and Slow has been one of the most read, probably highly influential psychological books. He catalogs a lot of the different cognitive biases that can overpower our thinking, can lead us astray, can create blind spots, particularly when we're going fast, right, as opposed to slowing down and checking our work. If you did read that book, you probably encountered this problem. If not, take a minute, see if you can work it out. So we have someone here offering an answer. Go ahead. Oh, 5. Oh, I see. That's a tricky conundrum, or tricky, what? There's the word for it, it has 2 meanings. Double entendre, let's go with that. This is me buying you all time if you want to work it out. Well, you see why I was confused. It is, in fact, as far as I recall, 5. Yes, and I can retrace the reasoning. Okay. If you thought 100, then you'd be in great company, because it turns out that a whole lot of people, including really smart, like MIT students, successful engineers, get this wrong. And it's certainly not for lack of mathematical ability. It's because they get lured by the false but intuitive gut response. You see 5, 5, 5, 100, 100, must be 100, and then you don't stop to think, wait, does that actually make logical sense given the setup of the problem? So again, an example of what is a drop in a very large bucket of such measures to get at the things cognitive psychologists care about. Okay, I'm going to go quicker through these other fields because ultimately I want to get to our deep dive, but I do want to just give you a sampling. So personality psychology, this is the field that deals with relatively stable aspects of our character and self. So it deals with questions like, what are the meaningful individual differences in how people think, feel, and behave? And by meaningful, we mean they're stable over time. They tend to predict how we actually behave in different situations. And they have various features that allow them to kind of be explanatory and be differentiating of us versus other people. They help us understand ourselves in contrast to our friends or whoever it is that we might be trying to force ourselves into, but it doesn't quite fit our natural tendencies. And also they're parsimonious, so the clustering of personality traits is a major focus of personality psychology. If you're not familiar with the Big 5, that's kind of the current going model of personality derived from lots of years of empirical work just to try to whittle down the thousands of descriptions of personality in the dictionary to some sort of tractably small number of traits that account for the largest possible number of those particular descriptions. And then statistical analyses on whether they actually tend to group together to describe people. Could go on and on, but that's the basic scope of personality psychology. I won't give too many more examples because one of the two findings I'll be deep diving on shortly straddles personality and developmental psychology, so you'll get a bit more of a taste at that point. Okay, then we have social psychology. What the heck is that? Social psychology is one of the more vaguely defined and scoped subfields. As far as I know, there's not really a good central definition. And you might think, well, it's the study of social things. But it's kind of not, because social psychology also is interested in a lot of not strictly social factors that impact our behavior and our attitudes and our thinking, like whether we've already purchased something that affects how we think about it and how much we claim to appreciate its benefits and depreciate its costs versus. So social is here a catch-all for contextual situational factors that influence people's thinking, mood, behavior in general. So typically social psychology is contrasted with personality psychology. Like these are two complementary disciplines, one of which is more concerned with how people are different from each other, and one is more concerned with how people all react to different situations. So we're taking we're like controlling away differences between people, and we're just plugging in people to different situations. So you could sort of think of it as this is the study of the messy complexities of life. It's a technical definition. The kinds of questions it's interested in, again, range widely, but involve all the different variables that might affect how we think, feel, behave in different circumstances. Just a random example that sometimes gets press coverage. Does playing violent video games make people more aggressive? If so, how? By what mechanisms? This is an example of an experiment. Social psychologists particularly love experiments where you randomly assign people to different conditions, which makes sense given the interest in situational factors. This is an experiment to see whether having somebody play a violent versus non-violent video game, controlling everything else, including who they are, because they're randomly assigned, and that they're playing a game, that it's on a computer, et cetera, does the group that played the violent video game end up, in this case, treating people more meanly by administering more annoying white noise to their alleged competitors in the game versus if they play the non-violent video game? So here, yes, the dependent variable differs by condition. We could debate what or how much that means, but it's an example of an attempt to get at causality. And then studies like, they could go on an ironic tangent about this one, but whether people are less likely to cheat after signing an honor pledge, and if so, why not? The plot spoiler is yes, sort of, except hold that thought, because the researcher primarily responsible for this line of research has now come under suspicion of data fraud. So remains to be seen, and invites broader commentary on. I'm sure he signed many such honor pledges, indeed. Dan Ariely, if you want to look up that sad affair. Anyway, so then, questions of more generally, how does the presence of other people affect what we do, how we think, how we feel, and how many people, and in what ways does it affect us, and what sorts of people? So this includes some of the really classic, widely studied psychology studies you might have encountered before, like the Milgram experiment, some of the experiments that we would never get away with today, like where people were told to administer potentially deadly shocks to what they thought was a real human being across the window from them, and they were a third of people went all the way to the top setting that might kill the person if a doctor in a white lab coat told them to do it. So some really alarming findings like that that we owe to social psychologists. Okay, so that's that field in a very short nutshell. And then there's developmental psychology, which studies human development. How does the mind emerge during adulthood, and what faculties come online at what points in development, and how does the child's mind get programmed, or does it come pre-programmed with anything? What does the child do? In what ways is the child an active agent in their learning? In what ways does the world impinge upon the child? What do adults impinge? What role do adults play, et cetera, et cetera. And again, as I mentioned, I'll be sharing an example that straddles developmental and personality psychology, so you'll get a bit more color at that point. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail here, partly because I couldn't even begin to scrape the surface, partly because I'm not an expert. It's a vast field in its own right, and it's really on the bleeding edge of human knowledge, which I think makes it both really cool, really exciting, and extra confusing. So that's why I sort of, approach it with caution. It includes, broad questions of how we understand biological systems, from the brain to our hormones, our cardiovascular and endocrine system, our fight or flight system, as underwriting the mind. In what ways do they underwrite the mind? What are the interactions between mind and brain, mind and body, and how can we learn about the mind by studying these systems, et cetera? One tiny example, to get a drop in the bucket, if any of you have encountered stories of lesion studies done in the now feels like early days of psychology, where somebody gets a piece of their brain surgically removed and then is closely observed and studied pre and post surgery to see how their personality changes, what happens to their memory, to their face recognition. The famous example of patient HM who lost the ability to remember, to retain memories for more than 15 minutes, who is a case example for anterograde amnesia, or what we came to understand as anterograde amnesia, that inspired, I think, Memento, right, is the movie. Anyway, so if you want a less scholarly treatment. But there's a wealth of fascinating research contained in this field, and also a lot of minds to navigate. All right, and then also questions around how the human mind is related to and different from the animal mind, and we actually have learned quite a lot through those kinds of comparisons, even just being able to test drugs on animals, on systems that we think have some overlap. Okay. Now we come to my field, which, funny enough, has the shortest slide treatment, partly because I'll give you my second of my two examples will come from clinical psychology, but also because there's almost too much to say, so I'm going to condense it a lot. So this is the field that concerns itself with the nature and treatment of, quote, the pathologies of the mind. If we're just concerned with the pathologies, then we might call that abnormal psychology, which is a kind of field in itself, but is really contained under clinical. So unlike many of the other fields that I've mentioned, clinical psychology is more like engineering or medicine versus the other sciences, which primarily are concerned with the understanding of the mind. Here we're also concerned with the improvement, the treatment of the mind. And we'll, as I mentioned, we'll concretize this a little bit when we get to example number 2. But first, and finally, but importantly, I want to say that clinical psychology is not the only subfield that's concerned with engineering or with the application of psychological knowledge. Okay, with the exception of positive psychology, which is really a widening of clinical psychology to include enhancement of well-being and functioning and not just remediation of illness, which I very much subscribe to that expansion. These other fields represent more applied and specialized interdisciplinary fields because each of them really applies psychological knowledge to an area of life or work that also brings its own kind of expertise and its own contextual factors. So if you want to ask more about any of these, I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Okay. So returning to our 3 broad sources of complexity, we can see how the topics of investigation in psychology sort of very loosely map on to these areas of complexity, and then the subfields that I just overviewed sort of very, very loosely map on to, but also really actually overlap across the different topic areas that fit under these different broad headings. So long story short, yeah, it's a mess, but a beautiful mess, I hope you will agree at the end of this talk. So part of what I want to drive home here is there's not really such a thing as a field of general psychology. There are people who will get as far as a PhD in something called general psychology in some universities, but even they really end up specializing. So as I mentioned, we're really a kind of happily semi-estranged family of related, sort of overlapping, but somewhat disparate and not always good at talking to each other subfields that all are concerned with the very broad topic of the mind. And an intro to psychology class typically would survey these various areas, but without offering a general framework. There are some competing frameworks and schools of thought that cut across disciplines, and they're typically presented in a kind of list-like fashion. There's cognitive behavioral theory, there's humanistic theory, there's psychodynamic theory, and these all have bearing on all these different subfields, but it's a list. None of them are the authoritative framework. None of them are anywhere near comprehensive. Okay. So if we now look at the genus of our definition of psychology, a science. What makes it a science? What does that mean? Or a loose collection, as we see, of sciences. Does this mean, in particular, how does it distinguish psychology from, say, philosophy, which is very much concerned with the mind, right, as part of its subject matter? And one way to understand this is that psychology picks up where philosophy, especially epistemology and ethics, leave off, in the same way that physics or engineering pick up where, say, metaphysics leaves off. And here I mean specifically with respect to the study of the mind. Okay, so philosophy tells us, in general, that people have the capacity and the need to think and to value, right? And it tells us about the general relationship of the mind to the rest of reality and about the general relationship of thoughts to emotions and so on. And then psychology uses specialized tools and methods of observation, of analysis, to go into much greater depth on how and why all of those things work, and under what conditions, and then what sorts of pathologies can arise. So for instance, psychology might specify that, say, humans who believe their abilities are malleable or changeable versus fixed are more curious about and less likely to evade their mistakes or feedback about their mistakes. And also, innate temperament plays a role, and intelligence plays a role, and parenting all play a role in how easily someone forms such beliefs in the first place. Or, psychology tells us, and it does in fact tell us, that about 1 in 5 humans who've encountered a life-threatening event then go on to develop post-traumatic stress symptoms that impair their ability to, or willingness to pursue rational values. And most of those people, by most I mean about 60%, so not like overwhelming majority, but certainly above chance that people who complete a 12-session treatment that guides them to process rather than avoid that traumatic memory, and thus to check the implicit conclusions they drew about themselves or the world on the basis of that memory, that those people tend to recover. So science looks at and it conceptualizes the nature of the subconscious, the brain, the body, in relation to the conscious mind. Right? It studies the bazillion variables that make these systems function and the gazillion ways they can malfunction. And these ways, the nature of function and dysfunction, their mechanisms, their interactions, the manifestations of these faculties in different contexts is incredibly complex and often surprising. Okay, so thank goodness that we have a good philosophy to offer some clarity as we dive deep into the unknown here and grapple with lots and lots of unclarity. The way that the mind works at this level of granularity is, as I said, it's the frontier of human knowledge, and I hope you find that as exciting as I do. Okay. To provide context for the experiments I'm about to share with you, I want to note that there are methodological through lines. So this is a unifying common denominator to all the various different subfields and disciplines of psychology. Psychology is a science in part in the sense that it uses systematic forms of inquiry that at least aim at the truth, at objectivity. And to accomplish that, they use methods that at least broadly serve that aim, partly by making visible to us how a scientist arrived at a given conclusion. Okay, the mainstay of psychological research are empirical studies. Okay, so typically this means that people are observed on psychological measures of interest, which have been developed through various iterative means of kind of checking different ways of assessing something across time and across different related variables. And then variation in one measure is analyzed as a function of other variables and/or as a function of differing experimental conditions. Okay, so again, not by any means the only set of methodological tools in psychology, but this is kind of the bread and butter of the field. Now, if you haven't heard, there are numerous problems with empirical studies in psychology. So I just want to go ahead and lay that out there now and sort of address it head on. Okay, and partly that's because, as I mentioned, psychology inherits all the bad premises and conceptual confusions of philosophy. But also, it's because studying the mind is actually really hard, even with the right philosophy. And I've had the right philosophy from the first day that I entered graduate school in psychology, and it's still been really hard. It's hard on multiple fronts, on multiple dimensions. It's hard to quantify psychological phenomena without unintentionally measuring the wrong thing or confusing one thing with another. It's hard to then make valid inferences from empirical data. And I think we'll see some potential examples of that. It's hard to successfully replicate empirical data, and this has come to light in a big way with the replication crisis that started in psychology and now has sort of spread to other fields. Sorry, other fields. But psychology is really, the ground zero. So there's lots of examples of this within the field, but what I want to do is actually get you to grapple with it first personally. So consider if you wanted to figure out the most important variables that affect your daily mood. How would you go about it? You might first make a list of plausible candidates. Like how well I'm doing at work, the quality of my conversations that day, my sleep, quantity and quality, my amount and type of exercise, right? Time spent outside. And this is not like your general happiness, but like your mood that day as opposed to other days, right? Like presumably you've all experienced some fluctuation in how good you feel, how confident, how energized, how optimistic. Okay, so, and of course there are also all of those different dimensions on which you could choose to measure and operationalize your mood, so that's already a decision point. Okay, but say you're trying to understand the causal contributors to your mood. Okay, so maybe the time spent outside, the books you've read, right, music you've listened to. Okay, so then how would you know whether your, say, effectiveness at work was the cause of your good mood or whether it was actually the effect of how good you already felt? Because we know that you work better when you're in a better mood. Okay, or also, are you sure that your estimate of the effectiveness of your work isn't itself confounded by your current mood? Because we tend to be a little bit more sort of optimistic, and everything seems sunnier when we just had coffee, when we're feeling better. So that's a documented effect. Okay, so is it that, or is it actually, like what's affecting what here? Okay. Also, presumably you're not going to see a perfect correlation between your sleep and your mood, and so you're going to see messy fluctuations. Say you've tracked it over a week or even over a month, and sometimes you've had a good night's sleep, but something happens, and so you end up feeling really down. But maybe you can discount that data point. But then other days seem like they sort of track, but then it's not that clear because all these other variables have some effect. So at what point do you say, oh yeah, there's a clear correlation here? And how do you know that you're not just spuriously, importing a correlation where it's not, because you already expected to see the correlation, and so you fall prey to confirmation bias? Or for that matter, are you sure that because you believe your sleep is an important factor in for your mood, and so you like focus on it and you optimize all these different things about your day to make sure you get a good night's sleep, as some people do. How do you know that just the fact that you expect to feel better isn't the thing making you feel better? You've all heard of placebo effects. How do you know that your sleep, in fact, is having any role at all, right? Apart from just you got this idea in your head, and it's self-fulfilling. And hopefully it's self-fulfilling in a nice, positive way, but it could easily also go the other way to the extent that you start to doubt it. So these are just a few of the kinds of questions you might need to grapple with. Also, good conversations. Well, since no conversation is like any other, how do you know which elements of the conversations that were mood lifting for you actually mattered? Like, is it the ones that the person that I'm talking to is really smart? Is that the important variable? Or is it that they've actually listened to me? Or is it that they happen to remind me of, my crush or my friend from back home? And how do I really know what the relevant variables are? Because it's always a little bit different, and there's always a million different things going on, and it's hard to control for all these different variables. And you're an N of 1. You're a sample of 1. You're just trying to understand yourself and the contributors to your mood. Imagine how much harder it is to generalize to the human population, or even some subset of that population, and to really reach reliable, valid, sound conclusions about the causal mechanisms underlying human emotion and the fluctuation in human mood generally. Okay, that's what the field is up against. With all of that said, empirical studies are the most interesting part of psychology. They're fascinating. Okay, even if the measures are conceptualized in confused ways that import bad philosophical premises, okay, and the meaning or significance of an empirical result is really not what it's taken to be, typically, or by the original researchers, still it's almost always a good faith attempt to describe something real about human beings, and to do so in a way that lends itself to objective scrutiny. So there's almost always something to learn from it. Okay, so if we really do this reframe, if we think of psychology, as Rand put it, as a pre-Socratic field, as early stage, and as significantly fragmented and philosophically confused, then I think we can reorient ourselves to think of experiments of empirical findings as more exploratory, as material to be used in our thinking. Okay, we can adopt this attitude of, yeah, this is a confused young field. What data is it generating? Versus what I often hear and what might be tempting to say instead, along the lines of, oh, what a bunch of determinists and empiricists, and most of them don't even believe in free will. It doesn't even replicate half the time. No wonder. It's all bad, bad, bad. I hear this attitude a lot, and I get it. I sympathize and look at all the problems. But I think we're missing out. As someone whose life is just dramatically, unimaginably, exponentially better because of psychology, I feel very strongly that y'all are going to be missing out if you don't do this reframe and really dive in and really engage with the observations themselves. And so in that spirit, I want to concretize for you all what that might look like by diving together into 2 empirical studies and sort of surrounding literatures that I thought you might find interesting, mainly to demonstrate how you might approach the study of any given study that you encounter after hearing this talk. Okay, so here we go. Buckle in. We're going to get specific. So the first example, raise your hand if you've heard of attachment theory, attachment styles. Okay, so not all, but many, which is what I would expect. It's an extremely influential line of research that will pop up all over the place. If you haven't already noticed it, now you will. Okay, so the experiment, the empirical situation that this researcher, Mary Ainsworth, created, set up, it was called the strange situation. Lab procedure she developed to test a theory that she had that has a long theoretical history to assess what she understood to be attachment of an infant to their primary caregiver. The cast of characters in the experiment were a 12 to 18-month-old child who gets called an infant, which is one of these things, why are they infants? They're toddlers, but be that as it may. Their mother, almost always, at least in the original rounds of experiment, officially the primary caregiver, and then a female stranger to control for the femaleness of mom. The setting was a laboratory room with some interesting, roughly developmentally appropriate toys and 2 chairs. The script, the laboratory procedure, was as follows. I think this was a total of 18-minute experiment. So first, the mother and the child would be placed in the room, and mother has been instructed ahead of time to get the child connected to play. Get your child exploring the toys. Show them the toys. Then at some point, a stranger comes in, and after 3 minutes of initial play with the stranger, the mother leaves the room. Then a few minutes go by. So this is the first separation that has happened between mother and child. Then mother returns. So remember, the stranger was there. The stranger tried to comfort the child. Now mother returns. The stranger goes away. Mother and child have their first reunion. 3 minutes later, so the mother's been instructed again to reconnect the child to the toys, comfort the child if need be, and then get them back to playing with the toys. Then the mother leaves. So now there's nobody for a second. Then the stranger returns, tries to soothe the child if the child is in distress, and that total separation goes on for 3 minutes. And then the mother returns again, so that's the second reunion, and the stranger leaves again, and the mother again tries to soothes the child if needed, then reconnects the child to the toys. That is the sequence of events. If you want to watch some actual clips, no spoilers yet. If you want to, What's happening here? It's going rogue. Are we skipping this on purpose? Okay, so I didn't just forget some prior intent. Okay, so if you want to watch an actual clip of the strange situation for yourselves, you can do so afterward. A little complicated and would be a lot of time to show you here. But if you want to watch one specifically without commentary, which I like and consider a feature, so you can just really see what's going on between mother and child and stranger, you can search for that specific thing in YouTube. Strange situation and attachment, Stephen Moret, who just happens to be the one who posted that video. Or if you just want to watch a bunch of examples, because there's a ton of them on YouTube, but mostly with annoying commentary, then you can look for strange situation experiment. So just a friendly tip for anybody who wants to see for themselves. Okay, but let me now tell you about the patterns that Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues observed. After observing hundreds of these dyads, now more like thousands, but at the time, she based the initial classifications I'm about to show you on her theory as checked, tested, and informed by the actual patterns that she carefully coded and observed or operationalized across hundreds of children and their moms, and that she then had other researchers independently code and observe and operationalize. And these were distinct patterns that emerged across those different toddlers that tended to cluster together, and as you'll see, were related to certain parenting practices on the part of the caregiver. So let me just go over the patterns themselves first, without giving you any sort of theoretical contamination as to, well, although many of you already sort of know what the labels are. But for those few lucky ones who come at this pure. So pattern 1 is as follows. So in this type of child, the following sequence tends to occur. And it's the most common pattern that Ainsworth saw. First, when mom and child are in the room, the toddler happily plays with toys and explores. Then, when mom leaves, both of the times that she leaves the room, the child gets visibly distressed and cries. And it's sad, and it's like sort of a hard part to see. But it's not like complete calamity. Just like, where'd you go? And then when the stranger tries to comfort the child, that doesn't really do it. Then when mom comes back, both of the times that they've separated, the child eagerly greets mom, is relieved, after a couple of sobs, pretty quickly calms down, and goes back to happily playing with the toys. So that's pattern 1. Pattern 2, and I know these pictures don't clearly differentiate the patterns, but in case you go and watch that video, you'll see that they represent the different types, so you can map them on. So the second type of child, Ainsworth observed, the pattern becomes most evident when mom leaves the room, or it initially becomes evident. That's the first place where there's a sort of fork. There's a differentiation between the two types of kids. This child doesn't seem to care. This child is fine. Doesn't even seem to really notice that mom has left the room. Keeps on kind of poking at the toys. Maybe with a bit less enthusiasm than the first type of child, but pretty contentedly by all indications. Doesn't seem moved at all, and doesn't seem moved at all when she reappears. Nothing seems to change for the child. The child just kind of like stays on what he's doing. Okay, so that's pattern number 2. And then pattern number 3 first becomes evident at the point when mom returns to the room for the first time, and then it's even more strongly evident when she returns for the second time. Instead of calming down pretty quickly and returning to the toys, this type of child is inconsolable. This type of child seems angry at mom, and at the same time clings to mom and is upset and crying and just continues to cry and doesn't seem really able to re-engage with the toys, despite the mom's efforts, which she's been instructed to undertake to get the child reconnected with the toys. So those are the 3 different types. So before I show you the official classifications according to Ainsworth, you can take a moment to explore within your own mind, like what might be going on with these 3 kinds of kids? Where have I seen these patterns? What could be good or bad or helpful or unhelpful about them, etc. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and contaminate. Yes, Ravital. I'll say the question. Yeah. Just in general, you mean that sometimes would happen. So Ravital's question is, or observation, is that sometimes are you talking like from experience? You remember with when you would return, but also, as you've heard from lots of moms, and I'm a mom, can definitely point to some instances of what you're talking about. When you return after a separation, your child will deliberately punish you. And that could look a bunch of different ways, but I think, so let's file that away as another observation. Yeah. So it depends on what you mean and what that looks like, because I think there are variants of the first pattern we talked about. Remember where I mentioned variants of, of the third pattern where the child gets angry with mom. There are variants of that pattern where you might see something that looks like punishing, in that the child might try to spite mom, the child, and also so it's important to remember we're talking about toddlers, so these are pre-verbal babies. All sorts of different things start to happen, and these observations cease to be applicable once a child is a verbal child. Attachment, or whatever this is, these patterns start to look very different when a child can talk to you. So that's important to keep in mind. So I don't know if you mean that like this 1-year-old baby. Yeah. In which case, I mean, again, like careful about drawing any strong conclusions about individual cases and how they map on, because as we'll see, this is all very messy. But if it's like a really consistent pattern, it could be some variant of a kind of anxious attachment where the child is upset at your leaving and is trying to get that need met, but there's a volatility to the expectation. but I would not assume that necessarily of your specific case. So let's come back to it maybe, because I want to hear from all of you about your own questions that this gives rise to, and I expect that there will be a lot. Okay, so let's see for now how Ainsworth understood these different patterns. So in her conceptualization, these 3 patterns reflected 3 distinct styles of attachment to the primary caregiver. Again, she's drawing on a whole theoretical foundation, which we're not going to talk about in any detail, but that we should know is a lens that informs how she set up the experiment and then how she interprets it. So the first type of child, type 1 that I described, she described as secure, or securely attached. The second she described as insecure, anxious, resistant. And the second she described as avoidant. I mean, the ordering is arbitrary. The second she described as avoidant, and the third she described as anxious, resistant. Yeah, which is the order in which I showed you the 3, if you're trying to map them on. And you can see here, the corresponding descriptions. Subsequent research led to the addition of another 4th classification called disorganized to capture another distinct pattern that emerged in a small minority of children who engaged in this experiment, or a small number of parent-child dyads. And it didn't cleanly fit the other 3 categories. So again, the researchers really are trying to respond to the data and check, update, revise their theories accordingly. So these children are initially cautious when they're in the room with mom, and then they get either extremely upset or sort of disoriented when mom leaves, and then they behave oddly, sometimes screaming or hitting themselves or throwing things when mom returns. Okay. So as I mentioned, these attachment styles, now 4 attachment styles, have been found again and again across literal hundreds of studies of cumulatively thousands and thousands of mother-child dyads. They've been found to be strongly, consistently associated with these distinct patterns of parenting, or distinct styles of parenting, whether as self-reported by the parents or as observed by researchers like in the home. The secure type of child tends to have parents who are what's called sensitively responsive, which means they consistently are aware of and correctly interpret the child's cues. Again, remember, these are pre-verbal children. So they tend to notice when the child is scared and wants comforting, when the child is tired and needs rest, but also when the child is sort of apprehensive but curious about some new toy or challenge and needs some space to explore, etc. And they respond accordingly to the child. The insecure avoidant type of baby tended to have parents who were generally less responsive and less available. They were kind of more distant and more kind of unresponsive even when the child needed them. And then the insecure, anxious, resistant babies tended to have parents who would hover and micromanage, helicopter style, and often do so out of their own anxiety, and who generally weren't that consistent in kind of when they were and when they weren't aware of and available to meet the child's needs. And then finally, the disorganized type of baby typically had parents who were also, quote, disorganized, by which we do not mean like you have poor organizational and time management skills. Here, what we mean is that there was usually a pretty deep, serious pattern of personality, problems, pathologies, often involving some form of abuse or more serious neglect and other forms of real harm. Okay. Good question. Good. I'm really glad, Ron, that you raised that question. You're ahead of the game. So why would the second category of child be considered insecure? Isn't this the most healthy, independent of the children who can regulate their emotions and doesn't freak out and can be just, connected to the world and focus on their work? Who cares what mom's doing over there? Isn't that the healthiest way to be? Good question. Let's see if we can learn anything from the data. to inform that question. Maybe, because we don't necessarily share Ainsworth's preconceived notions of, what's a good or a bad way to live, right? Okay. However, we have some findings that have emerged over the decades following those original strange situation experiments that call into question what might be some of our intuitive judgments. So this is the real clincher, okay, and what I think has really solidified attachment theory's enduring influence on the field and on the culture more broadly, which is what researchers found when they followed up with these same hundreds of babies and their parents, and later even their teachers and their significant others, 6 years, 10 years, 16 years, and then even 20 plus years after the original stranger situation experiment. So not only did the children stay in their classification, meaning that when they themselves completed an adult attachment measure, they completed measures, a bunch of other kinds of measures of their attachment to not just mom, but now other significant figures in their lives, they still tended to score the same. They were avoidant, or they were resistant, anxious, or they were secure. But also, their classification from the strange situation room predicted how they were doing in their relationships, again, not just with mom, but with peers, teachers, romantic partners, even predicting how likely they would be to get divorced in their 20s. It significantly predicted how they, their parents, and other observers described their mental health, particularly their depression and anxiety, at all of those later time points. It predicted how they would do academically in high school and into college, wherein the securely attached babies tended to turn into higher performing high schoolers and test takers and college students, and even get jobs that they described as more satisfying and so on. It predicted their self and other reported self-esteem levels. And we could double click on, well, how is that measured and is that a valid measure? But again, we're seeing this really broad pattern across a whole bunch of different measures and kind of ways at parsing the data. And then, it also predicted, perhaps not so surprisingly, how they parented their children once they had them, or if they had them, thus perpetuating the pattern. And what you can see here is that there are differences between the secure kids and all these other classifications, including our independently playing avoidant children who end up suppressing their emotions, who end up having intimacy and closeness issues such that they're either not in a relationship or they're divorced, and not doing as well academically, and just having a whole diffuse set of issues. Okay, so what do we make of these findings? I'll share what Ainsworth and colleagues made of them, because it's good to know. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll agree, right? But it's good context to have. So Ainsworth and her colleagues concluded, again, largely in line with, but building on their original theory, that children form an internal working model, that's their term, of important relationships as such, including even their relationship with themselves, based on their experience of the first important relationship, the one with their primary caregiver. And so if their caregiver is consistently responsive to their needs, then they form a positive working model, meaning that important people in their lives can be trusted to be there when they need them, and they themselves are worthy of support and care. Okay? Whereas if their parents are rejecting and unavailable, they form a model on which others are generally not to be counted on. And so better to not ask for things or get one's hopes up, lest you be disappointed. And if their parents are overbearing and inconsistent, then they tend to learn to question their own worthiness and to constantly vie for the fleeting and unreliable attention that of those they care about. Almost like an addict who constantly anxiously awaits the next fix, but sort of knowing and expecting that it's not going to last, right? It's just going to be a very fleeting relief. Okay. That's Ainsworth's conclusion. Okay, let's actually save remaining questions because I want to try to get through what's left of this study and tell you about the next one, which is even dearer to my heart. Okay, So that's what they conclude. So what should we conclude? Okay, do we agree with this model? Do we think it's all a bunch of crap? Like, how does it square with Rand's account of how children form metaphysical value judgments early on, which have a lot more to do with their relationship to reality, right? Their implicit judgments of whether the world is causal and knowable, whether they are fit to live in this world, whether they have free will. So why is that, primarily about other people? That doesn't seem to track kind of our view, the objectivist view of the important determinants of our kind of personality and health. Maybe this model only applies to second-handers who over-index on other people's judgments of them, and maybe it just doesn't apply to the rest of us. That doesn't quite square with the findings we just noted for the avoidant folks. And so, whoa, this is getting way ahead of us. Giving away all my questions. Okay, happy little button. Okay, let's stay here, or rather here. Okay. So rather than jumping to conclusions one way or another, I suggest that we approach this type of finding with curiosity. Like the way Rourke files away his initial experience with the dean, if you recall, when he kind of notices there's a pattern here and it's intriguing. And there's some sort of principle to be identified. Let me file this away and collect more data, right? So that at some point I can better conceptualize what's going on, what this difference between us actually means. Being curious means asking questions, and not the kinds of dismissive questions that I was just caricaturing a minute ago, but the sorts of questions that might eventually help us really understand and integrate these findings with our own knowledge base. Here are some of the questions that I had as I was studying these findings and kind of over the years that I've revisited them. One question that I might be wondering, and maybe some of you have these questions too, it's like, okay, well, how are the children interacting with the toys? We hear a little bit about that in the kind of first level descriptions and summaries of the different attachment patterns, but from a Montessori standpoint especially, are they engaged in work? Are they focused, or are they just flitting about distracted and playing with all these different things in a superficial way, right? Do they seem to have an independent interest in the toys and in these novel objects of reality, or are they looking for mom to cue them, right, to what they should do? Is this even about attachment at all, or are these just temperamental differences? This is a question that I had and that the field has engaged with, because it's a natural question, I think, that arises. Some babies are just more temperamentally emotional and slow to warm up, and wouldn't we expect that some babies just would freak out more when their mom leaves and have more separation anxiety? And wouldn't that get genetically passed down? So sure, it would look similar between mother and child, but what does it have to do with attachment? And why just mothers, you might wonder, right? All these early studies were done with the baby and the mothers. It's Father's Day, and so I especially want to, draw attention to the neglected and potentially important role that fathers play in helping their children to develop into healthy beings. And what about other beloved teachers, friends, maybe valued objects? What if instead of having mom leave the room unexpectedly and come back, what if we took away a favorite book, or a favorite toy that means a lot and that the child has spent a lot of time with? Would we see something similar? So these might be things that are on your mind, certainly have been on mine. How many of the one-year-olds who showed this insecure pattern actually then went on to have these problems, and vice versa? Are we talking about this is just fate, it's just 1-to-1? Or is this 1 out of 10 children, right? And it's actually a very loose mapping. And relatedly, what's always kind of most on my mind, how stable or changeable are these patterns? Are we stuck with our attachment style or whatever it is, or does volition play a role? And how does it play a role? When does it play a role? Both for parent and child. So luckily, and then other questions that some of you have already raised, right? Luckily, we have some answers. We have a partial set. I'm already previewing for you that there will be lots of questions that still remain. But if we dig into the literature, and if we're curious, we can actually get a lot of insight to help us think through these thorny questions. To the first question, if you actually read the code book, if you actually look at the full set of materials and classification criteria that Ainsworth developed, there's a robust difference in how the children engage with the toys between these different classifications. And in particular, only the securely attached children, who in turn, remember, have the consistently responsive parents, fully engage in a focused way with the toys, both before mom leaves and after she returns and they've settled down. The avoidant attached kids, they're poking at the toys, but their interest is kind of passing and superficial, and they kind of go from one toy to the next. Like they're not actually into it. Like they're kind of going through motions, but they're coping with something. And then later studies that actually hooked them up to like sensors and checked their physiology have actually found that their heart rate is elevated when mom leaves, but like they're not outwardly showing the signs of distress. Also, the question of temperament and attachment has been studied now ad nauseum. All the studies down here are meta-analyses. So each individual citation is actually the aggregation of like 100 to 1,000 studies that have been done. This has been well researched now. And so replication here is not like the kind of major issue that it is with some of the kind of newer findings. Attachment style just isn't that correlated with temperament. What's correlated with temperament is how upset a kid gets when mom leaves, yes, but that's not one of the criteria. Right? The biggest criteria, the differentiating factors are how does the child respond on mom's return? And to the first point, what happens when mom tries to re-engage the child with work? And that really seems quite independent of temperament. Not completely uncorrelated, but the correlation's quite small. And all those important predictive outcomes that I just showed you, they remain significantly predictive, even when you control for temperament as a variable. And we also see that attachment is one of the less heritable traits. We can't, the heritabilities estimated from twin studies and such, which we could separately double click on, are quite small. Okay. So what about dads? I did the deep dive to be able to give you all an updated summary of what we know here. And it's actually quite fascinating. There's been quite a lot of work now. It's way less than with moms, but like it's this like growing little pocket of literature. And it's super interesting. It turns out that there's less consistent correlates of their attachment classification with dad when they do the same procedure. Though you do see the styles kind of also pulling apart in similar ways, but it's not either as well predicted by other variables to do with the dad, nor does it predict as well kind of how the child will do in the future. But on the whole, what does emerge as a key variable is how the dad plays with the kid and the extent to which the kid the extent to which dad appropriately challenges the kid to play and like take risks. Fascinating. And annoyingly accurate, at least with respect to my own parenting experience, as you'll see pictured in a moment. Okay, so as to the actual size of the relationship, so like if you're an insecurely attached toddler, we'll correct, from infant, how screwed are you for when you, try to go and have relationships as an adult? And it turns out, yeah, these are significant correlations, and that's like a big deal for psychology when you get any sort of correlation at all across 20 years of longitudinal follow-up, but they're still kind of small. So 0.2 is the average correlation between your level of insecurity on the various measures Ainsworth, teaches you to code in infanthood or toddlerhood, and like the extent of your insecurity as an adult, and then all the other related outcomes I mentioned. So this is nowhere close to like fate. Okay, there's tons of variability here, and lots of people who jump categories. And finally, and crucially, it's not immovable. An infant's attachment style shifts in predictable, expected ways after an intervention that teaches the mom how to be more responsive, and like puts a little earbud in her ear and like coaches her on what to look for and sort of like how to appropriately soothe her child, but how to also give the child space and sort of how to chill out when it's appropriate to, and sort of work on her own, attachment needs in ways that don't kind of put a burden on the child. And crucially, if you're an adult who's already grown up with one of these attachment styles, it's by no means too late. You can actually shift your style through some therapy. And this has been well replicated again, and it's true of many different forms of therapy. It's not just like this one that's all about attachment. Cognitive behavioral therapy, with some focus on kind of your own dysfunctional attitudes and relationships, has been shown to increase your security. Okay, so it's not an answer to every question, but it certainly helps to clarify some things. So here's my tentative understanding to date, but it should not substitute for your continued exploration and inquiry into these questions. My understanding is that kids, in fact, depend on their parents when they're 1. That's just like journalistically true. They will die if their moms abandon them, actually. That's no longer going to be true when they're adults. They're, in fact, going to be able to fend for themselves and build their own life and be independent. But somehow we need to scaffold for them the journey from when, in fact, they're super dependent and helpless and are forming their implicit metaphysical value judgments that then they're going to carry through with them to the time when they, in fact, are independent. We need to make it such that in this world they're in as toddlers, they can move about and make choices and have predictable effects on the world, including us as the curators of that world, as though we were part of reality. A lovable, loving, supportive part of reality, but crucially one that's subject to their prediction and agency and reasoning about, causality. Rather than what I think we can easily become in spite of ourselves, which is arbitrarily powerful intermediaries upon themselves and reality, where they need to somehow manipulate our mood or get us to feel the right way so that then we won't, get in their way of being safe and exploring and getting what they need. And this is where I pay homage to the father of my child, whom you may have seen running around at this conference the last couple days, who famously embodies the sensitively challenging father who boasts on Twitter, across many threads that I recently compiled, of what a negligent father he likes to be by letting her fall off of monkey bars and climb tall stairs and trip over things while she explores her environment. And in fairness, it's worked out pretty well so far, and she seems all the braver in her exploration, but also all the more appropriately cautious in the times when, it's good to be and she's learned from experience. So, happy Father's Day to all the gently, appropriately challenging dads out there. Okay, so let me tell you about example 2 quickly enough that hopefully we have at least 5, maybe 10, 5 minutes for remaining questions. We can do it. Okay, so this example comes from the literature on rumination and depression, whose main pioneer was a woman named Susan Nolan Hoeksema, to whom I owe my dissertation research. She inspired and sort of laid the foundation for what I studied in graduate school, and a little bit after. And the concept that she's known for is rumination, as defined in the context of mental health challenges. The way she defined it was this mental mode of passively focusing one's attention on one's dysphoric or distressing negative emotional symptoms and on their possible causes and consequences. If you're curious, you can see this is the measure she developed and iterated across lots of different samples to assess somebody's general tendency to ruminate. So these are the kinds of things that people are asked on this measure. The study that I want to tell you about is one tiny, tiny drop in a very large bucket of such studies, but just so you can, again, get connected to the observations themselves and see for yourselves what is really going on. What is the observational basis for some of these later conclusions? So the cast of this study is a group of 76 adults who have been diagnosed with depression. They were previously hospitalized. Now they're either still depressed or they're in remission from being depressed, but they're depression prone. And the experimenter. They're in a laboratory room with cue cards, I assume on a table. That wasn't elaborated in the study or in the paper. The script or the procedure is as follows. First, they complete a baseline assessment of their mood in the moment, their current mood, which is a previously validated measure called the PANAS, positive affect, negative affect scale. It includes 10 items assessing each type of affect, so positive mood words, negative mood words, and you rate them on a 5-point scale from like, I don't feel this at all to I feel this extremely kind of thing. Once they gave their rating of those mood items in that moment, they then did what's called a sad mood induction. This is where we sometimes, as researchers, get a little bit mean in the spirit of science and in the interest of learning and helping people down the line. They recall 3 life events that when they felt sad, rejected, or hurt, and are told to concentrate really hard on remembering those events for 2 minutes per event, while simultaneously listening to really sad music, which in this study was the Adagio in G minor by Albinoni, in case anyone is familiar. It's very sad. And it's been validated, believe it or not, separately as, oh yeah, people actually find this sad. We do take great efforts to be objective in these studies. Okay, so then they did another mood assessment. They just re-rated, all of the items I mentioned. And then, this is the experimental part, they're randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions where they do one of 3 sets of things for 8 minutes. Condition 1 is the rumination condition. So we're getting them to ruminate because we're cruel and mean, but really because we want to understand. They're told basically to do the sorts of things listed in that measure I showed you. So like think about your current level of activity or energy, rather, the physical sensations in your body, what your feelings might mean about you and your future and the kind of person you are. Notice there are no actual negative words, but we've put them in a bad mood, so we kind of know what the inputs will be to those questions. But the prompts themselves are just like focusing them on how they're feeling and what it means, right? The causes and consequences of their mood. Then there was a distraction condition. So those participants just were prompted to think about random stuff. A boat slowly crossing the Atlantic, the expression on the face of the Mona Lisa, and a bunch of other stuff. And then in the mindful self-focus condition, as they called it, they were told, so this is also, they're looking at these same 28 cards, but these cards said things like, realize that all feelings, also negative feelings, are part of human experience. Take note of your thoughts and feelings without judging them. Consciously attend to your breath for some seconds, and so on. And then, after those 8 minutes were done, they rated their mood again. So here's the basic finding, the main finding in the study. There are other findings, and you can ask me at the end or after if you're curious, but the most central finding of the study was what happened to their mood from time 2, remember after the sad induction, but before the random assignment condition, to time 3, after the 8 minutes of whatever they were assigned to do. And the basic finding is that the ruminators, the ones randomly assigned to ruminate, did not experience the decrease in bad feelings or the increase in good feelings from time 2 to time 3 that the other 2 conditions did. So if you were in the distraction or mindful self-focus condition, you feel better and less bad by the end of those 8 minutes. You've recovered from your bad mood, that was induced by the sad music and the thinking about bad events. But if you ruminated, you're just feeling just as bad. That's the basic finding. This finding has been extended and replicated probably tens of thousands of times, if I had to just guesstimate, but at least, certainly thousands at least, in a whole bunch of different contexts and a bunch of different ways. What do the researchers conclude? They conclude, roughly, that this sort of abstract self-evaluative thought about oneself and one's own states perpetuates negative moods and should be substituted with concrete, non-judgmental thought, especially when you're depressed. You probably have a lot of questions. I know I did. I did a whole dissertation, in fact, to satisfy my questions. Like, well, so what if they have a negative mood that persists? Is that always bad? Sometimes maybe it's more important to feel the pain of a mistake or a past loss and then actually take action to repair the situation. Like, are we emotionalists here? Like, why is feeling bad, the end-all be-all of outcomes? What is really happening in the mindful self-focus condition? Is it really about not judging? Like, is that the big, savior? Or is it judging differently somehow? Like, are they implicitly reframing whatever sort of self-appraisals or judgments they would be making in the rumination condition? Also, isn't abstract self-evaluative thinking really important and good and essential to solving problems, gaining new perspective? Like, what, we're just going to throw out abstraction with the bathwater here? That can't be right. So, like, when and why would it be a problem, if at all? Or is this even the right way to conceptualize it? And how would the results differ if, say, participants were in a good mood, or at least a neutral mood, or if they weren't depression prone? Like, how specific is this to that one sort of combination of circumstances? And other questions? Yes, if anyone wants to quickly throw one out, because this might be your chance. Sure. Good question. Yeah, so like, isn't it good to have stability in your mood? And the rumination condition participants, they showed stability in feeling bad and not feeling that good after the initial sad mood induction. So you might ask, wait, what's wrong with that? Don't we want to be stable? And we could say a lot about that, but also remembering the context that here there's specifically been an artificial uptick in the stress, because they've just been subjected to this really sad music and sad memories. So there's an expected recovery. So you could say, like, stable would be relative to baseline, perhaps, and this isn't baseline. And they did all generally, on average, feel worse after the sad mood induction. So that bears mentioning. Okay. So here are some answers where they're available. And there are quite a few available, it turns out. And I know this literature intimately well, so I have an unfair advantage. But I think it at least gives you a preview of what you might find, to the extent that you decide you're curious and want to dig in and search on Google Scholar or just general Google for papers that speak to this. So it's not just mood, to the first question. Turns out that rumination uniformly impairs performance on all kinds of different cognitive tasks, your ability to problem solve across a bunch of different situations and contexts. It leads to worse mental health symptoms, both short and long term. It actually makes you less likely to take action. You pick an objective measure of psychological health, of life going well. Rumination has been shown to hurt that. So we can't rescue it. We can't defend it on those grounds. What about other conditions besides? Like, what is mindful self-focus doing? What's so special about it? So there are also a bunch of other studies, as I mentioned, that have used other control conditions to see, like, what is unique to rumination versus, what's about other, like, is it the judging? Is it the negativity? Is it the self-focus? Is it what? If you reappraise your negative judgments, like, what's another way of thinking about this? What would you say to a friend? That helps that's better than ruminating. If you just come up with concrete action steps, what's one thing I can do next? That's more helpful than ruminating. If you reaffirm your values, and this is partly a contribution that I made through my dissertation study, but there are other relevant findings. If you ask yourself the abstract, self-evaluative question of, what do I care about? What's important to me in my life? What kind of person do I want to become moving forward in my life? That's way more helpful than ruminating. So it can't just be anything abstract and self-evaluative. Okay? There's something about that type of questioning of yourself that hurts. People often report that their rumination helps them problem solve and gain self-understanding, and they're wrong. Those same people who say on a questionnaire, if I didn't ruminate or if I didn't worry, which turns out to be a lot like ruminating, I would lose sight of things. I wouldn't understand myself as well. It helps me gain clarity. And then we actually measure the extent of their clarity and insight and problem-solving ability and like whether it's better or worse after they ruminate, and it's always worse. But they don't know that. So there's some sort of disconnect between that expectation and what actually is happening. So whatever type of thinking this is, it's not the type that helps us live. And then to the last question, indeed it is somewhat specific to being in a certain kind of mood and or being prone to ruminating, to this type of thinking, such that you fall into a pattern of the kind of, like, remember, because you're seeing the same prompts. So like if somebody who's generally a happy, well-adjusted person who doesn't tend to ruminate and gets those same prompts, like think about how you're currently feeling, think about what it means about you. They make it useful for themselves. It doesn't inherently drag them down. So there's something that people are bringing to those kinds of questions that makes it really harmful for them. Okay, so here's my eventual understanding of this phenomenon and how I reframed it. And again, my whole dissertation study ended up being about it. So, you know, there's a long history here, and like accept this at your own risk, or better still, just keep thinking about it and being curious. But the way I've reframed the finding is that it's really this floating, detached, floating abstraction strewn, and emotion-driven mode of thinking. What I think it was Harry Binswanger at some point, he talked about emoting with words versus actually thinking, and we might think those are the same, but they're not. It perpetuates the crippling duty and helplessness premises, among others, but those especially as a kind of signature trait associated with rumination, and that it should be substituted with purposeful, reality-oriented thought, which, by the way, noticing concrete things about the present moment is an instance of, which I think is one reason mindfulness is helpful for people who have this tendency, because it's an alternative to getting sucked into your reality-detached, sort of self-loathing thought spirals. Especially if you're prone to anxiety, depression, or just like you're prone to ruminate in the way that Susan Nolan Hoaxema meant, you're better off doing any other kind of thinking than that. I've come to call this a distinction between actually judging, in the sense like you're actually trying to make realistic judgments about the world and about what would be helpful to do, or just pretense at judging. Like these aren't real judgments. These are just me stewing in my emotions and trying to unfeel what I'm feeling. Okay. Lots of other studies you could ask me about. This is a tiny sampling of ones I couldn't talk about today because I already have 1 minute remaining, but I'll be around and happy to take questions about really any studies that you're curious to talk about. Obviously, I could do this all day. But to conclude, this is a young field. It continues to struggle with its own insecurities and its own kind of inferiority complex, and that's not entirely unwarranted. And it's also particularly vulnerable to and blocked by bad premises from philosophy, from the humanities. But there's a lot of value to be mined from the field. And there's also just value in knowing and even maybe participating in a nascent field that's at the cutting edge of what we know about ourselves. So I hope you find that as exciting as I do. Thank you all.